Greetings, my dear viewer. You're on the channel The Price of Cheating. The channel is for those who appreciate traditional family values and condemn adultery. So be sure to subscribe to the channel. Let's get started. Mandy froze in place, unable to tear her gaze from the impeccably dressed man standing before her. His grave tone pierced the air like a dagger. "Amanda Black, you've been served," he declared, a flicker of regret softening his otherwise formal demeanor. The office seemed to hold its breath, an eerie hush descending over the space. In her trembling hands lay a document that shattered her world, a legal summons signaling the demise of her 5-year marriage. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed into her chair, stifling a sob as the weight of the moment crushed her. Gradually, the muted hum of office life resumed. Colleagues exchanged hushed whispers, sneaking glances in Mandy's direction. Some eyes brimmed with pity, others held a tinge of smug satisfaction. Mandy, lost in her own whirlwind of shock, barely noticed until a soothing voice cut through her haze. "Mandy, come on," Kit urged softly, her hand extended to help her. "Let's get you somewhere private." Kit's concerned face, framed by dark hair, offered a small measure of comfort as she guided Mandy out of the room. Behind them, the buzz of speculation grew louder. Once the vibrant, flirtatious soul of the office, Mandy now seemed a hollow shadow of her former self. Some coworkers snickered at the irony, while others simply shook their heads, resigned to their assumptions about her marital troubles. "How could this happen?" Mandy croaked, her voice quivering under the weight of disbelief. She hugged herself tightly, as though trying to keep from unraveling completely. Kit wrapped an arm around her shoulders, her presence steady and grounding. "I don't know," Kit admitted gently. "Did Eric ever say anything? Did he give you any warning this was coming?" "No," Mandy replied, her words thick with pain. "If anything, it felt like we were in the best place we'd been in years. He was acting like the man I fell in love with. I thought he was making up for lost time." Kit's face twitched at the mention, her unease subtle but unmistakable. Mandy noticed, her thoughts beginning to spiral. The past few months flashed through Mandy's mind, each memory sharper and more painful than the last. When Eric returned from Afghanistan, their marriage had been rekindled with an intensity she hadn't felt in years. Their passion was electrifying, their nights filled with a renewed closeness that bordered on euphoric. The memory made her blush, though the sweetness of it now felt tainted. "I mean, he couldn't keep his hands off me," Mandy muttered, a bittersweet smile tugging at her lips despite the tears pooling in her eyes. "After I got back from that business trip last week, it was like we were kids again. I thought we were good." Her voice trailed off as she caught Kit's wary expression. "I swear, Kit," Mandy said firmly, her tone defensive. "Nothing happened on that trip. You know I told you. It was over. I wasn't lying." Kit nodded, though her concern lingered, unspoken but heavy in the air. "Mandy," Kit said after a pause, her voice careful, "when was the last time Eric held you without an agenda, when he kissed you, really kissed you? When was the last time he made love to you, not just intimacy?" The question struck Mandy like a physical blow. She gasped, her hands flying to her face as fresh tears spilled over. "Why?" she whispered, her voice shattering under the weight of her grief. "Why would he do this to me?" Then, as if a puzzle piece suddenly clicked into place, Mandy stiffened. A terrible realization dawned in her eyes, draining the color from her face. "No!" she choked out, her voice trembling. He doesn't know, does he?" Her hands trembled as panic took hold. "Oh God, Kit, he knows!" Kit pulled Mandy into a firm embrace, her own tears threatening to fall as the gravity of Mandy's epiphany settled over them. If Eric truly had uncovered the truth, there would be no going back. Meanwhile, miles away, Eric leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. He held his phone to his ear, listening as the confirmation came through. The photos, the legal documents, it had all been delivered. "Thank you," he said calmly, ending the call and turning back to his laptop. A single keystroke set another piece of his plan into motion, each step meticulously calculated to leave a permanent scar on Mandy's life. "This is only the beginning," Eric thought, his lips curling into a faint smile as he dialed another number. "Hello," he said, his tone steady and resolved, as his orchestrated retribution unfolded exactly as he had intended. A chipper voice answered the call. "Human Resources, how may I help you today?" "I need to speak with Mr. Davis," Eric said coldly. "This is Eric Black." "Certainly, Mr. Black," the woman replied quickly. "I'll connect you right away." Moments later, Eric was speaking with the stern, no-nonsense John Davis. Though the conversation was brief, the tension between them was unmistakable. Neither man raised his voice, but their words carried an icy hostility. As the call ended, Eric took a deep breath, attempting to steady himself. He glanced at his phone screen and noticed 5 missed calls from his wife. Not now, he thought, pushing the distraction aside. Not yet. A sharp knock at the conference room door jolted him from his thoughts. When Kit opened the door, she immediately recognized the figures standing outside. Leading the group was Simon Samuels, the vice president and head of the branch, his posture radiating authority. Beside him stood John Davis, his face a furious shade of red, his anger almost tangible. Bringing up the rear was Anna Prescott, the office manager and Kit's immediate supervisor. "Miss Garnett," Samuels began with a solemn tone, "we need to speak with Mrs. Black. Thank you for your help. Please return to your desk." Kit nodded and slipped out, carefully closing the door behind her. Once the room was private, Samuels wasted no time. "Mrs. Black, we have a serious issue." Meanwhile, Mandy hurried out of the building, clutching a thick envelope tightly in her hands. Its damning contents, photographs of her and Sean Thompson, a manager from the 3rd floor in compromising positions, felt like a lead weight. Davis had given her the envelope, explaining the gravity of the situation in blunt terms. He also relayed his earlier conversation with Eric, who had threatened to reveal the company's failure to uphold its code of conduct. Eric, Davis had warned, was planning to consult Mandy, his estranged wife, before deciding whether to take legal action. Davis had instructed her to go home and speak with Eric immediately, cautioning her that the situation could escalate quickly. He also informed her of a meeting scheduled for the next day to determine her future with the company. Tears blurred Mandy's vision as she made her way to the parking lot. The sunlight reflected harshly off the cars, making it hard to find her vehicle. But there it was, her black Hyundai Santa Fe, a distinctive SUV among the rows of vehicles. She climbed into the driver's seat and froze for a moment, overwhelmed by memories of the arguments that had finally persuaded Eric to rent the car for her before his deployment to Afghanistan. Wiping her tears, she put on her sunglasses and drove away. From a nearby car, a man sitting in an old Chevy sedan discreetly pressed a button on his phone. "Thanks, Bob," Eric said calmly on the other end of the line. "No, that'll be all. Let Ron know you guys did excellent work. You've earned the recognition. Thanks again. Goodbye." He shut his laptop with a weary sigh. One more call, he thought. Just one more, and this would all be set in motion. But why hesitate? What reason did he have to look back? His wife had betrayed him, his trust was destroyed, and their marriage was in shambles. Shaking his head, Eric picked up his phone and dialed a number. The phone rang once, twice, and then a 3rd time before a soft click indicated the call had connected. Silence filled the line. Eric stared at the video feed on his laptop, his face unreadable. After a few long moments, a solitary tear rolled down his cheek. Meanwhile, Mandy navigated her SUV onto the highway, groaning as traffic slowed to a near standstill. She smacked the steering wheel in frustration. What should have been a quick 30-minute drive was shaping up to take over an hour. Her thoughts spiraled as she considered the ruins of her marriage. Was there any way to repair it? Deep down, she knew the answer. Eric had uncovered her affair, and while the man she'd known before his deployment might have forgiven her, the one who had returned was not the same. Forgiveness seemed impossible now. The photos, those damning photos, were undeniable evidence of her betrayal, discovered by Eric while he was stationed halfway across the globe. Mandy sobbed, the weight of Eric's emotions pressing heavily on her chest. She felt crushed by the pain she had caused him, but resolved to fight for their marriage, no matter the odds. Her love for him was unwavering, Even if her actions had betrayed that love, the self-reproach was relentless. "Way to show you care, Mandy," she scorned herself. "You cheated on him, twice, while he was serving overseas." She clenched her fists, attempting to suppress the overwhelming guilt, but the tears wouldn't relent. Trust had never come easily to Eric. His upbringing had seen to that. His childhood had been marred by abandonment. His father walked out, leaving his mother to battle her demons through the haze of alcohol. Over 5 years of marriage, Mandy had only met Eric's mother twice, once on their wedding day and again when their son was born. Winning Eric's trust had been a slow, arduous process. When they first crossed paths in college, she'd known he was a soldier and believed she understood the gravity of his life. By that time, he had already completed 2 years of service and was pursuing an engineering degree. They dated for a year before Eric proposed. Her father's reaction to the engagement was still etched in her mind. "This isn't about Eric," he had said, his voice calm but resolute. "I think he'll make a fine husband. But you? I'm not sure you're cut out for life as a military wife." Mandy's father, Mike Lomax, had served 4 years in the Navy when she was a child. She recalled the tension-filled arguments between her parents during that time and her father's determination to spare her a similar fate. "You were right, Dad," she muttered bitterly, shaking her head at the memory. "So right. I've been a terrible soldier's wife." At first, things seemed to be falling into place. Eric found a steady engineering job, and they bought a charming starter home. Their future felt bright. Then the orders from Uncle Sam came. When Eric received his deployment notice, Mandy's frustration boiled over, and she lashed out, accusing him of abandoning her. To compound her distress, she was already 4 months pregnant when he left for Iraq. As she navigated through dense traffic, she brushed away fresh tears, haunted by the loneliness that had engulfed her during those months apart. Her parents had tried to support her, stepping in as much as they could. But the nights were long, sleepless, and agonizingly empty. She yearned for Eric's strong arms and reassuring words, but he was half a world away. While she knew her anguish was selfish, Eric was fulfilling his duty. It didn't make the solitude any easier to endure. Her mother moved in for the last month of her pregnancy, easing the burden somewhat, but it was only a temporary reprieve. Lisa, her mother, had always been her confidant. Their bond often felt more like friendship than a traditional mother-daughter relationship. Still, there were boundaries Lisa wouldn't cross. Every time Mandy sought insights into her parents' marriage during Mike's Navy years, her mother would grow tense and quickly change the subject. Eric came home the day after their son, Randy, was born. For a brief moment, Mandy allowed herself to believe they had become a real family. But it wasn't to last. Just 10 days later, Eric was gone again. Her mother, ever observant, had noticed troubling signs in Mandy's behavior and urged her to stay strong, warning her about the potential consequences of even one mistake. Though Lisa didn't share details, Mandy suspected her parents had endured similar challenges. Their relationship, while cordial and functional, lacked passion. It seemed more like a partnership of convenience than a marriage. As time went on, Mandy found herself spiraling into a deep depression. Returning to work initially provided a much-needed escape. Then she began collaborating on a project with Sean Thompson. Sean was everything Eric wasn't. While Eric exuded a rugged, grounded presence, Sean had the polished allure of a Hollywood star. His smooth confidence, rich baritone voice, and captivating smile stirred feelings in Mandy she hadn't expected. She found herself drawn to him, her heart racing whenever he was near. Sean, however, was married to an elegant New York socialite, and his family had relocated to the area just a few years prior. Despite her growing awareness of how far she had strayed, Mandy couldn't stop the emotional freefall. She replayed her choices over and over, unable to ignore the pain and destruction she had invited into her life. She had encountered Sean's wife only once at a social event. The woman exuded a striking, almost synthetic elegance, with a persona that seemed as if it were plucked straight from the cast of a melodramatic reality show. Strangely, this only intensified Sean's appeal for Mandy. Within weeks of starting their professional collaboration, she found herself giving in to the lure of his attention. No, that wasn't quite right, Mandy admitted to herself. She hadn't merely yielded, she had initiated it. The escalation began during a brief 2-day business trip, where the harmless flirtation she had started evolved into a full-fledged affair. For a while, they continued to meet in secret, but Mandy cut things off abruptly just before her husband, Eric, returned home. When Eric came back, he wasn't the same man she had kissed goodbye. His light-hearted demeanor was gone, replaced by a haunted, withdrawn version of himself. She understood why. His deployment had been harrowing. Mandy still remembered the phone call after the tragedy that had shaken him. A vehicle in front of Eric's convoy had struck an IED, killing 3 of his friends and severely injuring another. Eric had been shattered by the loss. That day, Mandy had listened as he cried over the phone, her heart breaking for him while a heavy guilt sat like a stone in her chest. She had whispered words of love and encouragement, but her shame made her voice tremble. Just 5 days earlier, she had been in Sean's arms. In the weeks following Eric's return, she devoted herself entirely to him, holding him as if her touch alone could mend the wounds he carried. Her love for him was real and profound, and she convinced herself that her affair with Sean had been nothing more than a fleeting lapse in judgment. Slowly, life began to feel stable again, until the news of Eric's next deployment shattered her fragile sense of normalcy. When orders for Afghanistan came, Mandy was devastated. 2 months after Eric's departure, the loneliness became unbearable. Fear and isolation overshadowed the guilt she had tried so hard to bury, and she reached out to Sean once more. But this time, Sean's attention had shifted. He had begun flirting with a lively woman from marketing, and Mandy found herself working hard to recapture his interest. As she did, her shame only deepened, yet she couldn't stop herself. Her inner voice was merciless. You hate yourself for this, don't you? But you still went through with it. Tears often accompanied these scoldings, spilling over as the weight of her choices crushed her. Sean began visiting her regularly, even spending nights at her house. They took on another project together, strengthening their bond further. For a fleeting moment, Mandy even entertained the idea of leaving Eric for Sean. That illusion was quickly shattered. Mandy, her son Randy, and her parents traveled to Fort Bragg to see Eric during his R&R. The trip was fraught with tension. She felt certain her parents suspected something, though they never said so outright. All her apprehensions disappeared the moment she saw Eric. As he wrapped her in his arms and kissed her, she remembered exactly why she had fallen in love with him. Their time together was transformative. They worked hard to rekindle their love, focusing on their family and rediscovering the connection they once had. Eric's tenderness, passion, and devotion brought Mandy to tears, and she swore to herself that she would never betray him again. When Eric shared his plans to leave the army after this deployment and finally settle into civilian life, Mandy cried tears of joy and relief. Their family could finally be whole again. Upon returning home, Mandy severed ties with Sean for good. His anger was palpable, but she stood firm. She threw herself into preparing for Eric's return, determined to give him the life and love he deserved. Seeking professional help, Mandy was diagnosed with clinical depression. With therapy and medication, she began to heal, gradually finding strength and clarity. Each day, she resolved to be a better version of herself, a wife worthy of Eric's love and trust. When Eric returned home for good, Mandy kept her promise. She gave him her love, her attention, and her unwavering loyalty. Yet something between them had changed. Eric was quieter, his emotions locked away behind an impenetrable wall. Mandy attributed it to the trauma he had endured in Afghanistan, the weight of the horrors he had seen. But as she watched him now, staring out the rain-streaked window with an unreadable expression, a dreadful realization crept over her. Eric knew. He had somehow uncovered her betrayal. The thought filled her with terror, threatening to unravel everything they had rebuilt. The silence between them was oppressive, heavy with truths neither of them dared to voice. Eric remained motionless, his gaze fixed on the dreary gray sky, while Mandy felt the fragile threads of their rebuilt life begin to fray. The brief storm would pass soon. The clouds would dissipate, and sunlight would reclaim the sky. But not just yet. Not yet, Eric thought, staring intently at the blinking dot on his laptop screen. The tracker had been motionless for a while, stuck in a traffic jam. Now, at last, it showed movement. Mandy's SUV was on the move again. Eric let out a heavy breath, glancing down at his watch. It was time. Time to make the call that might very well be his last, to the woman he'd fiercely loved for 6 long years. Mandy's chest tightened as her phone vibrated on the dashboard. Her grip on the steering wheel became ironclad. Seeing Eric's name flash on the screen, she whispered a quick prayer, steadied her shaky breath, and pressed the answer button. "Eric?" "Yes," he replied, his tone deliberate and restrained. Her voice wavered as she struggled to hold back tears. "Please, let me explain. Let me tell you how sorry I am, Eric. Please, Mandy." His voice was steady, but there was a distance that hadn't been there before. "Eric, are you there?" she asked, desperation creeping into her words. "I'm here," he said bluntly. "For now." "Where are you? Are you at home? Is Randy with you?" she asked hesitantly. "I don't have a home anymore, Mandy," he said, his voice faltering for just a moment under the weight of his own words. "You made sure of that." "Please," she whispered, her voice raw with emotion. "Where are you? Are you waiting for me?" "Waiting for you?" he repeated with a cold laugh. "The way you've been waiting for me? Sure, Mandy." Her tears came freely now, her sobs reverberating through the line. His words hit her like punches, each syllable laced with pain and a fury she had never heard from him before. She despised herself for turning him into this. "Eric, just let me explain," she pleaded. "I've made mistakes, horrible mistakes. I've hurt you so deeply, but I love you. Only you. Please let me say my piece." There was a silence on the other end, heavy and unrelenting. "Go ahead," he said at last, his voice void of emotion. "Say whatever you think you need to. Just don't expect it to change a damn thing. You cheated on me, Mandy, not once, not twice, repeatedly. What could you possibly say now to make that right?" "Eric, please," she choked out between sobs. "For us, for our family, don't give up. Don't leave. Please, baby, don't leave me." "Don't leave," he repeated, his voice filled with bitter disbelief. "Like you left me? Like you left us?" "No," she shouted, her voice cracking under the strain. "I know what I did is unforgivable. I was scared, lonely. It doesn't excuse anything, I know that. But I never stopped loving you, never stopped believing in us. I want to fix this. Please, let me try." He scoffed, the disbelief in his voice unmistakable. "Fix this? You think you didn't abandon us? How do you explain screaming his name, Mandy, over and over? Do you think that doesn't count as leaving?" Tears blurred her vision as she tried to focus on the congested road, desperate to get to him. She had to see him, to make him understand how deeply she regretted everything. Maybe, if he looked into her eyes, he would see her sincerity and find some sliver of hope to hold on to. Eric's voice cut through her thoughts, sharp and bitter. "I finally have proof. Proof that my wife was unfaithful while I was deployed in Afghanistan. Do you know how lucky we are, Mandy? If I'd known back then what I know now, I might have killed you. You and that bastard." The silence that followed was suffocating. Then his voice returned, softer but weighed down by finality. "Amanda, this is the last time. If this call ends, if it drops or if one of us gets cut off, it's over. There will be no more chances." "Eric, please," Mandy sobbed, her voice trembling as panic took over. "We can still work through this," Eric began, his tone steady but laced with a false warmth that felt more like a taunt than reassurance. "We can see a therapist together, try to mend what's broken. But before you head back to your life, there are some things you should know." He didn't pause for her to respond. "First off, I emptied all of our accounts and maxed out every credit card we have. For 3 years you've been sneaking around behind my back. So I figured it was only fair to level the playing field," he said, his voice icy. Her sharp intake of breath didn't deter him. "As for the house, it's yours. Honestly, I'd rather not step foot in that bedroom again, feels tainted. Oh, and don't worry about my stuff. I took what I needed. It all fit in one suitcase. The rest, consider it your problem." He gave a laugh, hollow and bitter. The SUV's yours too. Good luck keeping up with the payments, especially since I hear you're losing your job tomorrow. Just a little heads up. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Oh, and about those photos, the ones you wouldn't want anyone else to see? I shared them, sent them to your colleagues, your family, our friends, and even the church group. Let's just say you're about to become quite the topic of conversation. You're welcome. Mandy's face contorted in anguish. Eric, no, please, let's just talk this out, she begged, her voice trembling with desperation. Eric's expression remained calm, almost indifferent. Talk? Really? I gave you 4 months, Mandy. 4 months to come clean after I got back, not a word. And now the only reason you're saying anything is because you've been caught. Am I wrong? His piercing stare seemed to pin her in place. She couldn't deny it. The truth hung heavy between them. And about your little fling. His lips curled into a smirk. Sean, isn't it? I thought about confronting him, even paid his wife a visit. Turns out I didn't need to do much. She's got her own plans. Her family? Let's just say they're not people you'd want to cross. If I were you, I'd warn Sean. He's on borrowed time. Oh, and about those side pieces of his? She's dealing with them too. Funny, isn't it? That includes you. Eric, please, Mandy whispered, tears streaming down her face. Give me a chance to make this right. Her phone buzzed, and she glanced nervously at the screen. It's Mrs. Johnson next door, she murmured, her voice unsteady. Eric's tone sharpened. I warned you, Mandy. If you hang up on me, you'll regret it. No, I wasn't going to hang up, she stammered, fear evident in her voice. I thought it might be about Randy. Randy's fine, Eric said softly, though the sudden change in his tone only deepened her dread. He's with me right now, fast asleep. Don't worry, he's safe. Mandy exhaled shakily, relief momentarily overtaking her panic. But speaking of Sean's wife, Victoria, Eric continued, his voice taking on a sinister edge, while you and Sean were on your little business trip last week. He was interrupted by another notification. Mandy glanced at her phone. Mrs. Watson this time, she muttered under her breath. Eric let out a dark laugh. You can let her know Randy's fine. He's right here with me. The malice in his voice sent a shiver down her spine. Anyway, back to Victoria, Eric pressed, the amusement in his tone growing. She's quite something, isn't she? While you and Sean were off playing house, I spent a couple of days getting to know her better. And let's just say she was very forthcoming. Mandy's hands trembled on the wheel as his words cut deeper. Tears began to blur her vision, but Eric continued, relentless. Not that she's much better than you in bed, he added with a cruel chuckle. Honestly, she's worse, always whining about what she wants, how she wants it. There's no room for fun with someone like that. I'm sure Sean would agree. He laughed again, the sound sharp and unforgiving. So congratulations, Mandy. You've officially hit rock bottom. Stop it! Mandy screamed, her voice cracking as sobs racked her body. Just stop! She slammed her fists against the steering wheel in frustration, cursing the slow-moving traffic that trapped her in this nightmare. After a long pause, she wiped at her tears, trying to steady her voice. Fine, Eric, she spat bitterly. You win. Are you happy now? You got your revenge? You obliterated me. She sat motionless, wrapped in silence, yearning for his reply, but only emptiness answered her. I still love you, Eric, she murmured, her voice trembling and faint. I know I can't excuse what I did, but I'm begging for a chance to set things right. Please, let me explain. There are medical issues you need to understand. If you ever cared for me, even a little, meet me, just once. Medical issues? He retorted with a bitter edge. What is it this time? Postpartum depression, clinical depression, bipolar disorder, PTSD? Does any of it even matter, Mandy? None of it stopped you. You still went ahead and cheated. His tone sharpened, his words laced with scorn. How do I know? That's irrelevant now. No, it does matter, she cried out, her voice breaking under the weight of her desperation. Eric didn't flinch. When I started suspecting, I brought in professionals. They tapped your phone, installed cameras, even put one in our bedroom. Her breath hitched, her voice quivering with shock. Oh my God, Eric, how could you? You went to such lengths. Is your hatred for me so complete? What about the love we once shared? There was love, he said, his voice dipping low, until I watched the footage, you and him, in our bed. His tone trembled, anger mingling with raw anguish. Do you remember when Randy walked in on you? Do you, Mandy? Her face paled at the mention. No, please don't. He cut her off sharply, his emotions barely restrained. Imagine how I felt, sitting there, watching my 2-year-old son call another man daddy. That night I watched you tuck Randy into bed, with him. Whatever love I had for you died in that moment. Her sobs broke the fragile silence between them. Eric's tone turned colder, harsher. I guess it's a twisted kind of luck that I didn't find out until we were stationed at Fort Bragg. When I saw the footage, God, I nearly lost it. And you know what happens when someone loses control in a place like that? It's fatal. He turned back to his laptop, his eyes narrowing as the GPS tracker inched closer to its target. A cruel smile twisted his lips. You think I've already hurt you? Amanda, this is only the beginning. A sharp gasp escaped her on the other end. What are you talking about? What are you planning? Surprises, he replied, his voice frigid and detached. Minutes later, Mandy's SUV screeched to a halt at the curb. Her breath caught as she stared, horrified, at the inferno consuming their home. Oh my God, she choked out, trembling. Eric, what have you done? A rhetorical question, don't you think? He replied, amusement lacing his words. I was trained to build things under combat conditions. Naturally, I know how to dismantle them just as effectively. Where's Randy? She screamed, panic swallowing her whole. Eric, where's our son? Our son, Eric mocked, is right here with me, fast asleep in his car seat, safe for now. But tell me, Mandy, did you see the message I left on the front lawn? Her voice faltered, dread clawing at her. What message? Eric chuckled darkly. It's probably hard to make out from the ground, but the news helicopters should have a perfect view. I thought cheating whore burned into the grass was an appropriate touch. Her cries intensified, uncontrollable and filled with despair. Eric's voice remained steady, merciless. Don't expect pity from the neighbors either. I made sure they all know. Paid a few kids to distribute some pictures around the block. Call it a public service. He let the sound of her sobs fill the silence before hanging up, his heart calcified as the chaos he left behind consumed everything. Mandy, you might want to start planning, Eric said, his voice sharp and unforgiving. Where you're going to sleep tonight, and for the foreseeable future. Maybe that SUV of yours? At least until the repo guys come for it. I wouldn't count on Sean either. By now I bet Victoria's tearing him apart. His lips curled into a smirk. That just leaves your parents, doesn't it? Imagine how thrilled your dad will be to have not one but 2 women like you under his roof. Mandy swallowed hard, her voice trembling. What are you talking about? Don't play dumb with me, Mandy, Eric snapped. You're not that naive. You told me yourself. Your dad cheated on your mom while he was in the Navy. And surprise, your mom wasn't exactly faithful to him either. Mom? Mandy's voice cracked, barely audible as if saying the word might break her. Eric's laugh was cutting. Oh yeah, your dad let that slip after I got back from Iraq. It's funny, isn't it? Makes me wonder if he had an inkling his daughter would follow in her mother's footsteps and cheat on her husband. He stared at the phone, his tone icy. But here's the difference, Mandy. I'm not your father. I don't have the stomach to stay with a cheater. Maybe your dad stuck around out of love or for your sake, who knows? But me? I'm choosing a different path. I need a wife I can trust, someone loyal, someone who can be a real mother to Randy. Eric, please, Mandy sobbed, her words pouring out in desperation. I can be that wife. I already am a good mom to Randy. I'm his only mom. Eric's voice turned colder, detached. That's not up to you or me. The court will decide. Though, to be honest, he paused deliberately. My little stunt with burning down our house and draining our accounts probably won't win me any points with a judge. Mandy's breath hitched, her mind racing to process what he'd just said. While she struggled for words, Eric's attention shifted to a young man stepping out of a cab nearby. The man, wearing a baseball cap and a casual t-shirt, glanced in Eric's direction. Eric signaled him with 2 quick flashes of his headlights. "Listen up, Mandy," Eric said, glancing at his watch. "There's a lot you don't know, and we're short on time. First, don't get too cozy at work. I won't press charges, but Victoria, she's coming after you with everything she's got. And thanks to all the evidence I gave her, her case looks pretty solid." He coughed lightly before continuing. "As for me, I'm not sticking around to see how it all plays out. I've taken a job overseas. Randy and I need a clean slate. It'll be better for both of us." "No!" Mandy screamed into the phone, panic overtaking her. "You can't take my baby, Eric. Please don't do this." Eric's reply was like a blade. "Actually, Mandy, I can. He's my son." "He's mine too," she cried, her voice breaking under the weight of her despair. Eric let out a slow, measured breath. "In a few years, Amanda, he won't even remember you. But don't worry. I'll send you pictures at Christmas. Maybe even call on Mother's Day or his birthday. Of course, since I won't know where you'll be, I'll just send those to your parents." Mandy's sobs grew louder, more frantic, as if she could will him to reconsider. Eric sat quietly for a moment, the sound of her anguish cutting through him in a way he hadn't anticipated. For the first time, he felt a twinge of doubt, a question about just how far he'd gone. He wouldn't send pictures. He wouldn't call. Deep down, he knew that. The thought of her waiting for a call that would never come struck him as crueler than anything else he'd done. "Goodbye, Mandy," he said, his voice devoid of warmth. "Rot in hell." Her cries escalated, raw and hysterical as he ended the call. A single tear slid down his cheek, and he wiped it away, startled by its presence. "Captain Black?" the young man by the curb called out. "Not anymore," Eric replied with a faint, weary smile. "Just Eric Black. For now." The man approached, handing over a thick envelope. Inside were the account numbers and passwords for the offshore funds Eric had transferred, minus the hefty fees. Alongside them were forged passports, IDs, and plane tickets for Marcus Gray and his son, Michael Gray. "You're all set," the man said, grinning. Eric nodded, his future neatly contained in that single envelope. Eric's grin stretched across his face as he carefully collected his old identification cards and a pair of SIM cards from his phones. With deliberate movements, he dropped the items into a small metal bucket, a glint of satisfaction in his eyes. Producing a lighter, he ignited the contents, watching intently as the plastic warped and melted into a formless, charred mess. Once the last flame flickered out, he reached for a hammer, reducing the phones to a pile of jagged shards. Satisfied with his handiwork, he dumped the remains into a trash can, the act carrying an air of finality. Everything had gone exactly as he'd envisioned. Still smirking, Eric retrieved his car keys and handed them to a young man waiting nearby. "Make sure Bob and Ron know I'm grateful for the loaner," he said in a low voice. The young man's face mirrored Eric's mischievous expression as he replied, "Bob and Ron? Who's that?" "My mistake," Eric replied smoothly, his grin deepening into something playful. Moments later, he was at the airport, weaving through the crowd to check in his luggage. Excitement flickered across his face as his mind danced ahead to the weeks he had carefully mapped out for himself and his son. With his new job not starting until next month, Eric had arranged a much-needed escape. The plan was simple, a secluded, sunlit beach where he and his son could unwind. But it wasn't just about the ocean and sand. Waiting for him there was someone he hadn't seen in years, a striking lieutenant he had befriended during a tour in Afghanistan. Back then, their connection had been purely platonic, but now, armed with undeniable proof of his wife's betrayal, Eric couldn't help but feel a spark of anticipation. The future, he realized, was brimming with possibilities. "Mr. Gray?" called a man behind the counter, his tone polite and professional. "Wishing you and your son a pleasant flight." Eric nodded in acknowledgement, his confidence unshaken. With his son at his side, he walked purposefully through the bustling airport, leaving behind the remnants of his old life. A fresh chapter awaited them, full of promise and uncharted adventures. This concludes the story. If you like it, then put your powerful like and subscribe to the channel.